I'm Chris Starling. I'm the Director of Military and Veteran Affairs here at the Marines Memorial Club, and I'd like to welcome you to our Meet the Author series with Norm Fulkerson. And our book tonight is American Night, the story of Colonel John Ripley. Colonel Ripley is a legend in the Marine Corps, and if you go down on the fourth floor, about halfway down the hallway on the right, you'll see a picture of Colonel Ripley, and you'll see the citation of his Navy Cross, where he took out the bridge at Dong Ha. This was in 1972, Easter Offensive in Vietnam, and he was serving in an advisor capacity during that time. But Colonel Ripley was one of those legends who was still on active duty when I came in the Marines. And in fact, I left college in 1988, and my brother started college in 1988 at Virginia Military Institute. So we high-fived on the way out and in at VMI. And the new professor of naval science that year was Colonel John Ripley. And he was there to see my brother through 4 years of college. And at the time, it was very competitive, as it still is, to become a Marine officer. And my brother's grade point average wasn't quite where it needed to be in the Marine Corps. And I hope there's no Navy veterans here or that I don't offend anybody, but if you don't have grades good enough to be a Marine, guess where you're going? If you're in the NROTC program. So that's just the way it was, and that's kind of how it is now. So my brother, facing that, went to Colonel Ripley. Colonel Ripley wrote a letter on my brother's behalf and said, hey, war fighting is about being a leader, and this individual has the leadership qualifications. And only later did I learn that Colonel Ripley himself had those same grade point average issues in his younger years, that he had a spot in his heart for that. Leadership is about being a leader and being able to inspire others, and it's seldom linked to a grade point average. And so that's kind of the man that we're going to talk about this evening. Norman Fulkerson was raised in Red Hill, Kentucky, and is a 25-year veteran in the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property. He's a contributing editor to TFP's Crusade magazine, which has a circulation of over 130,000. And in his Only in America column, he describes the little-known cultural richness of the United States. So he is currently residing in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania, and he's come out here to share his book with us. Please join me in welcoming Norm Fulkerson as we discuss the life of Colonel John Ripley.
Thank you very much, Colonel Starling, and I would also like to thank General Myatt for having me here, and all of the people at the Marine Memorial here. You've been very, very, very kind. So I'd like to begin by explaining I am a member of the Association Tradition, Family, and Property, and I will answer the first question that some people may have: how did you get to know Colonel Ripley? And it was actually through this association, Tradition, Family, and Property. We exist as a group to fight against the moral crisis in society. We do that through educational means, but we base the work that we do on this book called Revolution and Counter-Revolution, written by our founder, a man named Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira. Our founder basically was a man who was a history professor, most voted congressman in Brazilian history. His life spanned the 20th century, but from a very early age, he saw the moral crisis in society, and because he loved history, he traced the origins of this crisis back over 500 years. So he ended up putting his ideas in the form of a book, and he described this crisis. He referred to it as the revolution, which he said works to spread disorder in society. And he defined the counter-revolution, those who fight against it, as fighting to reestablish Christian order in society. So the book is divided into two equal parts. The first part dealing with what is the revolution, what are its goals, its methods, its tactics, and then the second part defines the counter-revolution, which are the goals and methods and tactics of those who fight against this revolution. I wanted to mention that at the beginning because that's how I got to know Colonel Ripley. He was a great supporter of our organization, but I also wanted to mention it because we have a great likeness to Marines. Marines have fought in every clime and place, and the members of this association do also. We fight a war that's every bit as serious as any war that was fought by Marines, excuse me for saying that. And the reason I say that is because we fight not against an enemy that destroys bodies, but destroys souls. So we work in the realm of ideas and ideals. So this book is very, very important because it explains that. Now, one of the so the fight between the revolution and counter-revolution is a fight between order and disorder, and therefore it's very linked to a more recent work that we've come out with, written by fellow TFP member John Horvat, Return to Order. Originally, the author of this book was going to come. We were going to do a dual launching, but I highly recommend this book. It addresses the current economic and moral crisis in society, and the solution that Mr. Horvat, the author, presents for our current problems is something he calls organic Christian society, which most of the book is devoted to explaining what that is all about. It's essentially the opposite of the socialistic, mechanistic society that we see being implemented around us. So I wanted to say a word about this because when you speak about revolution and counter-revolution, order against disorder, this book speaks about how we return to order. Some of you I see you're scratching your heads wondering, when is he going to get to Colonel Ripley? Well, I'm going to get there now. Because an essential part of the return to order that Mr. Horvat speaks about is something that sociologists refer to as representative characters, something that is that we commonly speak about as role models. Role models play a very important part in society. They're leaders. We need leaders. And that is exactly what Colonel John Ripley was, the man I dubbed an American Knight. He was a shining example of what Mr. Horvat is speaking about. Colonel Ripley died in 2008, and his passing sent shockwaves through the blogosphere. His obituary eventually appeared in the New York Times, and like so many other newspaper articles, the Times recounted the story of a man who blew up the Dong Ha Bridge during the 1972 Easter Offensive. And this is understandable because, considering the fact that Colonel Ripley almost single-handedly halted the largest communist offensive of the entire Vietnam War. For 3 days, he had been without sleep, very little water, and almost no food. Nevertheless, he somehow garnered enough strength to hand walk under the bridge like a kid on monkey bars because he had to get the explosives into the belly of the bridge. It took him 13 times back and forth into the belly of the bridge, each time carrying two 20-pound satchels of plastic explosive. Colonel Ripley later told the fact that he was also carrying his rifle, his canteen, other material that he really didn't need to carry that, wasn't going to be of any use to him. But he was a serious Marine. Well, during the 3-hour operation, he felt his strength fading, and because Colonel Ripley was raised in a very devout Catholic family, he decided to invite God to come along. So just as the Marines have that rhythmic chant to get them through grueling exercises, Colonel Ripley improvised and made a kind of a Catholic version of that, and he started to scream out loud, "Jesus, Mary, get me there! Jesus, Mary, get me there!" Louder and louder, so loud that even his South Vietnamese counterparts, perhaps not knowing what they were saying, they started screaming it louder too. And all the while they were saying, "Crazy Captain, crazy Captain." Well, the bridge eventually went up in smoke, and it stopped 30,000 troops and 200 enemy tanks dead in their tracks. He would eventually sum up his actions in a very succinct way, in a very Marine way. The bridge was there, the enemy was there, and I was there. What else would one expect from a man who is described by the Marine's own Leatherneck magazine as someone who would not back down from a charging rhinoceros? Well, Colonel Ripley showed this same fearlessness off the battlefield in the civilian world. And if you read An American Knight, you will find that that is what I consider the high point in this man's life. It's his moral courage. He spoke out on numerous cultural issues, especially those being imposed on the military and which are detrimental to good order and conduct.
This was especially in the mid-90s. I don't think I have to tell you what those issues were. You can find the full text of 2 of his testimonies on those issues regarding homosexuals in the military and women in combat in An American Night. They were personally given to members of the TAP by Colonel Ripley himself. He was not ashamed for having given them, nor was he concerned by the fact that he was stepping on some big toes by doing so. These issues that we speak about, they remain unresolved and divisive. And I found this out firsthand from a Rear Admiral, who will remain nameless. He personally knew Colonel Ripley, and he purchased several boxes of An American Night for his friends. Some time went by, and this gentleman called me and asked if there would be a reprinting. Actually, I'm happy to say we're in our 5th printing. And I told him there would be, and he asked if it would be possible if in future printings that side of Colonel Ripley's life be left out. And the reason he gave was because, we could sell more books, we could reach a wider audience. Well, my response to him was very succinct. Absolutely not. For to do so would leave a gaping hole in the personality of this great man, and I simply refuse to do that. It is for this reason that I was delighted by the fact that An American Night received a gold medal in the category of biographies from the Military Writers Society of America. But I was even more appreciative of the review done by that organization's most liberal member and founder, Bill McDonald. He began by explaining how An American Night delivers the riveting life experience of a real hero without any worry about being politically correct in today's world. I'm not very politically correct. He continues, no matter how one feels about his testimonies, one has to admire Ripley's courage to say what he felt in his heart and not step aside from controversies. He was as uncompromising and courageous on and off the battlefield. His social views certainly made him very few friends on Capitol Hill or in political circles, and surely ended his military career hopes. If you do not understand duty and honor, then you will never understand John Ripley. He was all about honor and duty, and he was willing to put it all on the line. And this is the part I like the most. This is coming again from the most liberal member of this association. I did not agree with all that John stood for with regards to his social beliefs, but I have to admire his ability to cut through all the superfluous and get right to the point, regardless of what the results would be, again, to his career. He was someone that we veterans could admire. He was always true to his self and to his personal beliefs. What more can we ask of anyone? And to finish, he said, I personally recommend this book regardless of your political or social views. It will teach you about true courage, close quote. Now, I want to just finish by explaining what the question that's most frequently asked is, why did you write this story? Because first of all, I personally knew Colonel Ripley. I considered him a friend. But I also felt certain that his story might never be told because he was controversial. And that was a big part of Colonel Ripley. Both of his sons told me that he testified on a number of issues, but he did so willingly. No one had to twist his arm to get him to do it. He actually liked to speak out on those issues. He also was quoted as saying, after the book was published, someone told me that if you ever wanted to know Colonel Ripley's opinion on something, all you had to do was ask, but you had better be ready for the response because he would tell you the truth. So the first reason that I had in writing the book was a sense of justice. This is the virtue whereby man renders to each what is due to him. I could do nothing less for this great man. Mysteriously enough, I was egged on in this project as much by Colonel Ripley himself as anyone. In a letter to a friend, he said something which struck me like a voice from beyond the grave. When I started writing the book, Colonel Ripley had already passed away. He said, "If a young officer or Marine ever asks, 'What is the meaning of Semper Fidelis?' tell him my story." After reading such a thing, I could not fail to tell this man's story, including the non-politically correct side of his life. He would have wanted nothing less from me. But the other reason I chose to tell his story was the desire to console hero-seeking Americans like many of you who yearn for a role model like Colonel Ripley, who they can admire and emulate. During the researching of An American Night, I took time to read numerous website commentaries after his death and was really inspired by the eulogies posted by average Americans. One man, no doubt inspired by the Marines' hymn, which speaks of heaven being guarded by United States Marines, said the following: "We claim Semper Fidelis as our motto, but it was Colonel Ripley's life. His loyalty was complete and in all directions. The earth is less today without his soul, but the heavens are a safer place tonight." Another comment was even more impressive, but it demands a certain introduction. Colonel Ripley was an outstanding officer who took great pride in the position that he earned, and actually this can be seen very well in the picture that I chose for the cover of the book. This picture, actually, some of you may recognize this. This is in a Marine pictorial book by Anthony Edgeworth. But this picture, taken by Anthony Edgeworth, I think really captures the soul of the man. Yet he was a man, Colonel Ripley, that had a profound humility and never wanted attention drawn to himself. Colonel Ripley was not a man who tried to impress others with his Navy Cross and legendary status. In fact, he would often point out the achievements of those of lesser rank and frequently expressed his unbounded appreciation for the common grunt who, quote, "gets the job done." But he always did this in a very refreshing way without ever adopting the one of the guy's egalitarian attitude so lamentably common among people of higher station. Colonel Ripley was a Marine Corps officer, and he was not ashamed of it. Yet he never missed the opportunity to challenge those around him to reach higher. It is for this reason that towards the end of his life, he gave himself wholeheartedly to mentoring. He loved to counsel young men starting out in their military careers. So all of this helps understanding better a comment of a midshipman after Colonel Ripley's death. "This is the same man who sat at dinner with me and asked me, a first-class midshipman, about to be commissioned as a second lieutenant, to sign his program for the evening because he was going to read about me in the papers and all the great things that I did for the Marine Corps." I can hear Colonel Ripley saying that to this young man. He finishes, "I walked with a hero, Semper Fidelis." Well, I saved the best eulogy for last, and it comes from a mother of four who defined herself as a simple American woman. I pray that someday she know how moved I was to read her words. "I never had the honor of meeting Colonel Ripley," she says. "In fact, before a dear friend suggested that I look him up, I had never even heard his name. But I have sat here and read the stories of his life and countless postings by people that loved him, and I will miss him dearly. I am a simple American woman enjoying a world that Colonel Ripley dedicated his life to protecting. I am humbled by the recounts of his heroism and tireless dedication to his country. I suppose I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you from the core of my being and on behalf of my 4 children. When the time is right, I will teach each of them of this great man, Colonel John Ripley. May God bless your soul." Close quote. So to conclude, I would just like to say Colonel Ripley did truly live a life worthy of a book. But even if there had never been a book written about him, his deeds are recorded in that magnificent work called the Book of Life, and so are yours. Therefore, I recommend you follow Colonel Ripley's example. Be courageous, be honorable, and be always faithful. Thank you very much.
And one of the things as a Marine that we knew about Colonel Ripley that was kind of legendary among the young officers was his training as a young midshipman and then later as a junior officer. He went to some pretty unique military schools, and that was always something that was a topic of discussion along with his heroic actions at the bridge at Dong Ha. Can you talk about the training a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I was speaking to the two fine gentlemen here, the Miller brothers, about that subject. Colonel Ripley, at the time of his death, he was one of only, I think, only two people on the planet that had the in-house distinction among members of Force Recon as a quad body. And that distinguished him as being a person who had gone through 4 of the most grueling special forces programs in the world. So he was Force Recon, went through the Army Ranger course. He was the first Marine ever inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame. He also went through the UDT program. They were the precursors of the modern-day Navy SEALs. And finally, he also trained with the British Royal Commandos. And that was actually interesting. We were discussing that earlier. He went through that program between his first and second tours in Vietnam. So he was in Vietnam in '68 and then in '72, which I found kind of humorous because that training obliged him to go from the climates of Southeast Asia to regions of the north where temperatures dipped below 40 degrees below zero. And so the thing is, at the time of when it came time for him to blow the Dong Ha Bridge, he was literally armed to the teeth with the expertise to blow that bridge. He was one of the premier warriors of the day, and I mean, what more can you say about a man like that?
So I'm going to ask the second question too. When we talk about the bridge at Dong Ha, the political and the military situation in Vietnam in 1972 was pretty bleak, and I've spent time in an advisor role in part of my career, and advising a foreign military is pretty difficult duty. Advising a foreign military in the middle of combat is, multiple times more difficult, and advising a foreign military when the handwriting was on the wall. The Paris Peace Accords were a short time away, and so we had advisors. We had downsized to less than 30,000 troops in South Vietnam at the time, and advisors were on the front lines, but not many American combat forces were. Can you talk a little bit about that political military situation and his view of that, along with his Vietnamese counterparts, to whom he was also very loyal?
Yeah, that's in 30,000 words or less. The political situation, Colonel Ripley was very well aware, as I think most, if not all, of our Vietnam vets were, that they were fighting a losing battle, not on the battlefield itself, but in political circles. And on one occasion, Colonel Ripley gave several talks to our organization, and obviously we just ate it up. And I remember distinctly in one of those talks he gave, he made reference to Henry Kissinger's, I guess it was his autobiography, where he said that they knew the Easter Offensive was going to be launched years before. I recently came across an article written by an Army intel officer, which he more or less said the same thing, that there was intelligence that showed us that something big was coming, yet they had a skeleton crew to deal with that. So something was definitely awry in what took place there. But I do want to address I think the second part of your question was how to advise of members of a foreign military in the situation of battle. Now, that's another conversation, part of our conversation we were having earlier. This morning I had the privilege of visiting with Colonel Lee Ba Binh, who was Colonel Ripley's Vietnamese counterpart. And Colonel Binh is really a hero. He had been fighting for 13 years before Colonel Ripley arrived in 1971. After the collapse, he was captured and suffered basically a prisoner of war, forced labor for 13 years before he was finally released. And it was very interesting, although he was a seasoned warrior, which gave him a certain sense of battlefield tactics and what have you, he explained the wisdom of Colonel Ripley. And it was very curious. He said that he saw this a number of times. Like Colonel Ripley, they'd be in the middle of a battle, and Colonel Ripley would say, you know, they're going to attack us from either there or there. But he said it's more likely that the attack will come from this side. And he would have the guns zeroed in on that area, and they would attack, and he would call for the bombardment and just destroy the enemy. So Colonel Ripley, dealing with his counterpart as all the Covans, I understand you're having the Covan reunion here, they were all very admirable men who basically they lived in the same conditions as their South Vietnamese counterparts. They ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and they earned the respect of the South Vietnamese Marines and soldiers, and that's the way that they were able to deal with that situation. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that answers it. And there's a certain amount of cultural immersion that you have to go through as an advisor, which, again, you carry your own values and your own training through that, and you can't compromise that, yet you are that example, not just to someone in your own culture, but another culture. It's a very tricky situation to be in.
Very tricky.
So I'll open it up now to our audience for questions. Colonel Ripley's citation for the Navy Cross is comparable to many of the citations that are on our walls here at the Marines Memorial Club for the Medal of Honor. Why was Colonel Ripley considered for the Medal of Honor, and why wasn't he awarded the Medal of Honor for that heroic action?
Yeah, it's a very good question, General Myatt, and if I had a nickel for every time I was asked that question, I think I would be a millionaire. Because if you read the story, and the thing is, a citation, as any citation for the Navy Cross or even the Medal of Honor, they're very impoverished as far as really giving the details of what the individual did on the battlefield. And so there's much more even to what Colonel Ripley did than is in his citation. But to answer your question, I don't know the process whereby the person even gets awarded a medal in the first place. Once you get awarded a medal, how it's upgraded. I was recently at an event where I met a gentleman, I forget his name now, but he was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. I understand there are several, actually 5 Navy Crosses, including Colonel Ripley, that they're still talking about upgrading them. I personally believe, I have a conviction that he will one day be upgraded. But the story that I heard why he did not get the Medal of Honor is because he performed his actions in the middle of a very intense battle that continued for weeks after. And Colonel Ripley said, although as dramatic as the blowing up of the bridge was, the intensity of the battle just increased. So they were filing a fast action report. Actually, I think it was Colonel Turley that told me this, the man that gave him the order to blow the bridge. And they just really didn't have time to put together all of the details and the paperwork because they were fighting a war. That's the story that Colonel Turley tells it's not just Colonel Turley, but others, that's the explanation that came back down the pipe, that it was not, it was basically a question of paperwork.
Yeah, another piece of the Medal of Honor is the number of eyewitnesses that you have to have, and those eyewitnesses have to be Americans who witnessed the battle. And in an advisor role, he was one of 2 Americans that I believe that was with that company at the bridge. So you really didn't have the number of American eyewitnesses that you needed. The Vietnamese were quick to also support and document anything that he did, but perhaps that was part of it as well.
Exactly. And I don't know how many American witnesses you need, but Major Smock, who was actually handing him the explosives through the wire as he was climbing out into the bridge, he was an eyewitness. And as I understand, he basically corroborated what Colonel Ripley did. So, and there are people that read more into Colonel Ripley not getting the Medal of Honor, which I don't make comments regarding that, because, as I said, I'm not in the Marine Corps. I don't understand, or I wasn't in the military. I serve our country in a different capacity. I don't know how those things work, but he definitely deserved the Medal of Honor, and I know a number of Medal of Honor recipients who say the same thing.
How many of his family members did you contact, and what was their role in providing information?
Yes, it's interesting. It'll give me a chance to the way I came about writing the book, I received an inspiration a year before Colonel Ripley died. It just popped into my head to write this man's story, and I had never written a book before, and I thought, well, I guess a book, is like a bunch of articles. I've written many articles. You just sew the chapters together. And I didn't act on it, and then when I got the news that Colonel Ripley died, it was prematurely, that I thought, I didn't write this book. So I went to his funeral, and I met members of his family. I had never met his children, nor at that time it was the last living member of his family, his sister, who passed away this year. But I spoke to members of the family. I spoke to people that served with him that said he did things on numerous occasions for which he should have received the Medal of Honor, and I decided I've got to write this man's life. So I was more or less started researching at the funeral as far as just getting stories. But I was in the middle of doing other works with our organization, so it was a question of writing and doing the task that I do public relations work with our organization and giving meetings and traveling. But to answer your question, yes, I spoke primarily. The book consists of interviews with people that knew him, that fought with him. I dealt primarily in the family, all of them I interviewed, but especially his 2 oldest sons, Tom and Steve, who were Marines, who resigned their commissions as they reached the rank of captain. And I interviewed other cousins and what have you. And it was very interesting from that point of view, but the person that helped me the most was his sister. She was the one I'll never forget. She said, I changed John's diapers. And I thought, I got to speak to this lady. And she tells the joke. It's funny that she's from Radford, Virginia. I think you're from Radford, Virginia, aren't you? Or you studied there?
School there.
You went to school in Radford. But I called her up, and she tells the story a little bit incorrectly, that I called her initially, and I said, look, I'd like to write this book about your brother, and I'd like to come and visit you, to interview you for a day or two or something. And I ended up going there, and she says I ended up staying 5 days. So she was the biggest help, because she really helped me to see the character of the man, especially his youth, because that helps a lot in a biography. This is the only biography of the man. So anyway, to answer your question, yes, I dealt with the family very closely. And Steve Ripley, the oldest son, wrote the introduction for the book. Colonel
Ripley, in his younger days, was maybe more wild than later after he'd gone through his military training. And what is the backstory to that?
You said more mild?
Wild.
Oh, wild. Yes, wild he was, and how he tempered that. And that's actually a very good question. There's a chapter in the book titled Radford's Huckleberry Finn, because he was notorious for just doing things that boys do. I mean, he was an all-American boy, which I think it makes it very readable and very good for a younger reader. I've had very young boys read it, and they love it, and it's good for them because they can relate to that aspect. He was blowing things up and getting into trouble, but the turning point in Colonel Ripley's life really, I think, was when he went to the Naval Academy. and his grades didn't allow him to get in, so he had to go through a preparatory school to get his grades up. And basically his father, Bud, was stayed on top of him. Bud was a kind of a chesty puller. He always had a cigar in his mouth. The only time he took it out was when he went to Mass, and he would put it on the ledge of the church before he went into Mass, pick it up on the way out. But anyway, it was when he was at the Naval Academy that he really saw an image, this is the way I say it in the book, an image of what he could be, and he set his sights on that and never looked back. Because you have to understand that Colonel Ripley, he attended the Naval Academy, he graduated, but he graduated academically. He was like second to last, I think, academically. But he had some of the highest marks in leadership and other qualities like that. And he became a voracious reader. And one of his best friends, Paul Galante, who was a great man, is a great man, POW, he said that Colonel Ripley became a virtual philosopher. He's the foremost historian on the Battle of Iwo Jima. So the thing is that you have a man that was kind of, I don't want to say out of control, but he was pretty wild, very wild. And then he goes to the Naval Academy, and it's like he sees what he could be and goes after that. But that transformation really occurred at the Naval Academy.
Rich Bodkin was here probably about 2 years ago. The book was called Ride the Thunder. He presented that book here. That book is one in which Colonel Ripley also figures very prominently, and now he's also turned that into a film. Are you familiar with those at all?
I'm very familiar with the film. I have not yet seen it, but I've heard very good things about it. Rich Bodkin is a very good friend, and I owe Rich Bodkin a lot with my book because his came out shortly before mine, and he allowed me to use the edited parts of his book for my book as far as the research purposes go. Rich is a great friend, and like I said, I have not seen the movie, but I've heard great things about it, and we had discussed that earlier as well. A lot of people, they read the book, they know Colonel Ripley's story, and they say, why don't they make a movie about this man? The fact of the matter is, when Colonel Ripley was still alive, he was approached by members of Hollywood who wanted to make a film about him. And I liked Colonel Ripley's response very much. He said he would agree to help as long as two things were respected. The person portraying him should not be portrayed as having had a romantic relationship with someone in Vietnam, because he said, as a rule, I have never been unfaithful to my wife, Malene, and I never will be. But the second thing he said, also noteworthy, he said, I do not want the person portraying me using foul language, because as a rule, I don't use such language. And that's a kind of an interesting fact, because at his funeral, General Conway, who was the commandant at the time, he said about Colonel Ripley, it was very amusing. He said, he spoke about him not using foul language. He said, the closest thing I ever heard him say to a cuss word was doggone it. But anyway, so what Rich Bodkin did is a very great thing. It's not just about Colonel Ripley, but there is a part in there about Colonel Ripley. But they're still talking about, I get people reaching out to me from Hollywood from time to time. A screenwriter recently contacted me about writing a screenplay. He was actually in the office of one of Mel Gibson's producers, saying that he wanted to write a story. But to date, there has not been another film. But Rich Bodkin's film, as I said, it's a great film.
And I think to summarize what you've talked to us about, you have an example of a man who lived his life well. You have a man who had physical courage in the face of overwhelming odds in front of an enemy, where he conducted a mission where it was very likely that he would be killed in the executing that mission. To go out like you're climbing on monkey bars underneath a bridge girder 13 times to plant explosives and make it back, and then in one of those cases it didn't detonate, so he had to go back out and put another fuse in. So, and then to complete the mission under that dangerous situation, the physical courage, but you also have in Colonel Ripley the moral courage of having the courage of your convictions and sticking to it and not swaying with the breeze, one way or the other. And that was kind of deeply rooted in his faith, how he was brought up, but also in how he was trained. And so to kind of summarize what you're saying, the things that we can walk away and learn from Colonel Ripley's life are the physical courage and the moral courage aspects, and living your life on that line and not deviating from it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there are many lessons to learn, but those are the two that I focus on. It's the physical courage and the moral courage. And Colonel Ripley wants to find moral courage as the wherewithal to stand up for your principles when they turn up the heat. And many times he had the heat turned up against him. Actually, this is something that I didn't put in my book for obvious reasons, but he said the testimonies that he gave on those issues, those hot button issues, they were controversial, but it was the one on women in combat that he was told by his superior officer, he was asked not to do it. But Colonel Ripley told us that he said, I was not ordered not to do it. And since he was a serious Marine officer, had he been ordered not to do it, he would have saluted sharply and fell out. But since he was not ordered, he went ahead and gave that testimony. But he said that after giving that testimony, he was persona non grata at the United States Naval Academy. A man who had received the Navy Cross, received all of this. He was a legend. But then over time, Colonel Ripley, the ice melted around him. But again, I reiterate what I said in my remarks. I did not want this man to be forgotten, and especially that aspect, because the thing is that we're in the situation that our country's in large part because we lack the people to speak out and to say the truth on these issues. And the thing is those issues, if we cannot look upon those issues as existing in a vacuum. In other words, there is a process of decadence in our country. So the acceptance of the things that we're accepting now, they continue. So for example, now we're talking about accepting transgenders into the military, which I can't even wrap my head around that one. Now there are people that are going to throw stones at me for that, but I don't understand that. But that's not the end of the process. Where do we go next? That's my question. And that's actually a question that I ask a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs who speaks at an event every year, and he talks about how he's happy by the fact that they repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell because we don't discriminate. Well, Colonel Ripley gave the best arguments against repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell because he said it's not a question of discrimination because the very fact that the military, or actually it is discrimination, but he said the military is a discriminating organization. They discriminate against the too fat, the too flat-footed. There are many things that will prohibit you from being in the military. So where does this all stop? And that's the question I asked this former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but the last 2 years at this event, he says the same thing in front of a group of young cadets from the different service academies. So he stands up there as a man of position, and it's more or less sends the message that if you want to advance in the world today, you have to be in line with these things. And Colonel Ripley was not a man to do that. So we're not going to turn our situation around morally, economically, or otherwise until we have men like him stand up and speak.
Colonel Ripley, he was at Virginia Military Institute. When he left there, he went to a struggling college nearby called the Southern Seminary. It was a women's college. He renamed it Southern Virginia College, and he ran that as the president of that university, got it back on its feet, financially sound, and it's still going now. And then he moved to the Marine Corps Historical Society, which was also in disarray. And he reorganized that and got that back on its feet. And I was thinking about it today, what Colonel Ripley did for the Historical Society, General Myatt did for the Marines Memorial Association, in a way, in bringing these organizations up to a certain first-class level. And so we're very blessed to have, if you go to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico now, the person who kind of laid the groundstones for that was Colonel Ripley many years ago. And we're fortunate here on the West Coast to have this institution. So we pretty much got the whole country covered from east to west. So with that, I would like to, well, one more question or statement.
John Ripley was a friend of mine, and he was so focused on the family. And when he had orders to Okinawa, he said, "No, I'll go to Okinawa with dependents, or I can go to Okinawa by myself. My sons are in this high school, they're doing well, and I want them to continue to do well. I need to go to Okinawa without my family because it's important to my family." I just never have forgotten that his commitment to the family first was paramount in him. I respect him so much because that probably prevented him from making his next grade in the Marine Corps. John Ripley was a superman, and he was dedicated to the family.
Very good comment, General.
On the 10th of December, we have Will McCants will be here. He has a new book called ISIS Apocalypse. He used mostly Arabic sources. He speaks Arabic, and he's going to talk about this problem of the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. A lot of new research, really new materials that he sifted through, and the book has gotten pretty good reviews. It's been on NPR. He will be here on the 10th of December at 1800 to talk about that book, so that's our next event. And with that, I'd like to thank Norman for coming all the way from Pennsylvania. And with that, we'll adjourn and sign some books. Thanks again, Norman.
Thank you.